You wake up every morning with the comforting sensation that your world is stable, predictable, and safe. You check your bank accounts protected by complex passwords, observe the security cameras that watch over your home, feel at ease with your carefully calculated life and health insurance policies, and walk the streets, trusting that the institutions you've known since childhood will continue functioning as they always have. This sense of control and predictability isn't yours alone. It's shared by billions of people around the world who have built their lives on the fundamental premise that they know the rules of the game and that these rules will remain relatively constant. But what if I told you that this sense of security is one of the greatest illusions in human history, and that we're about to witness its complete collapse in a way that not even the most pessimistic thinkers could have anticipated? What if the very structure upon which we've built our perception of stability is about to be so drastically reformulated that the categories we use to understand reality, risk, and protection will become completely obsolete? Over the next few minutes, we'll explore together how we reached this historical inflection point and why 2026 may mark the moment when humanity awakens from a collective dream of security to discover it was living in a world completely different from what it imagined. To understand the magnitude of the approaching transformation, we must first recognize that our current perception of security is a historically very recent and extraordinarily fragile phenomenon. For most of human existence, our ancestors lived in a state of constant uncertainty where survival depended on adaptive skills developed over millions of years of evolution. They knew that life was unpredictable, that danger could emerge at any moment, and that their security depended entirely on their capacity for immediate response to environmental challenges. Agriculture brought the first great illusion of control, allowing human societies to create surpluses, develop specialization, and build the first permanent structures of protection. Over time, these structures evolved into increasingly complex systems of laws, institutions, markets, and technologies, all designed to create a sense of predictability and stability that would allow long-term planning and the development of entire civilizations. The 20th century represented the apex of this illusion, especially in the decades after World War II, when developed societies created systems of social security, financial regulation, international cooperation, and technological progress that seemed to guarantee an increasingly safe and prosperous future for subsequent generations. We built not only physical institutions, but also mental and emotional structures that allowed us to believe we had tamed the chaotic forces of nature and human history, creating an environment where risk could be calculated, managed, and largely eliminated through careful planning and systematic application of scientific knowledge. What we didn't realize, while celebrating our achievements in creating increasingly sophisticated security systems, is that we were simultaneously building the seeds of our own vulnerability. Each system we created to protect us also created new dependencies, new failure points, and new types of risks that didn't exist before. The global interconnection that allows resources to flow efficiently around the world also means that a disruption at any point in this network can propagate instantly to all other points. The digitization that made our lives more convenient also centralized critical information in systems that can be manipulated, hacked, or simply fail in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. The specialization that allows modern societies to function with incredible efficiency also means that most people have completely lost the ability to survive independently of the complex systems on which they depend. More fundamentally, we created a culture of responsibility and delegation, where individuals transfer responsibility for their security and well-being to specialized institutions, gradually losing not only the practical skills necessary for self-preservation, but also the psychological capacity to imagine and prepare for scenarios where these institutions could fail or behave in unexpected ways. This responsibility delegation created a form of collective infantilization where entire societies became dependent on parental systems that promised to take care of all their needs without them needing to understand how these systems actually work or what would happen if they stopped functioning. The technological revolution we've experienced in the last 2 decades has dramatically accelerated both our illusory sense of security and our real vulnerability in ways we're just beginning to understand. The internet and mobile devices created the impression that we have instant access to all the information we need and that we can immediately connect with any person or resource necessary in case of emergency. Apps on our phones tell us exactly where we are, how to get where we want to go, what the weather forecast is, what the health risks are in our region, and even monitor our vital signs and activity patterns to alert us to potential problems before we become aware of them. This profusion of information and apparent control has given us a sense of empowerment and security that is almost completely illusory because it created absolute dependence on systems we don't control and don't understand. When your phone tells you there's no traffic on your usual route, you don't question how this information is collected, processed, and transmitted, nor do you consider what would happen if this system were compromised or simply failed. When algorithms select the information you see, determine which products are offered to you, and even influence which people you meet through dating apps, you're living in a completely mediated informational environment that can be manipulated in ways you cannot detect. The apparent convenience and efficiency of these systems mask the fact that they represent a form of dependency deeper and more dangerous than anything humanity has ever experienced before. What makes the situation particularly dangerous is that the systems we depend on for our security have become so complex that no one really understands them completely. Global financial markets operate through high-frequency algorithms that execute millions of transactions per second based on logics that not even their creators can fully predict or control. The distribution networks that bring food to our tables depend on logistical chains that extend across multiple continents and involve thousands of interdependent variables that can be disrupted by apparently minor events in locations we can't even locate on a map. The energy systems that power our civilization depend on infrastructure so complex and interconnected that specialized engineers admit they cannot completely predict how the system will react to significant disruptions. More worryingly, the political and social institutions that should protect us against these systemic risks are themselves operating with mental models and conceptual tools that were developed for a much simpler and more predictable world. Political leaders who make critical decisions about our collective security often don't understand the technologies they regulate, don't comprehend the interdependencies of the systems they supervise, and don't possess the intellectual tools necessary to adequately assess the emerging risks we face. This is an unprecedented situation in human history. A species that created systems so complex they exceed its own capacity for understanding and control, but continues to depend on these systems for basic survival. Artificial intelligence represents the culmination and acceleration of all these trends, creating an inflection point where our illusion of security can collapse, not gradually, but suddenly and irreversibly. The AI systems already being integrated into critical infrastructures are not just more powerful tools, they represent a fundamental transfer of decision-making power from humans to algorithms that operate according to logics we cannot completely understand or predict. When AI systems begin making decisions about credit, employment, healthcare, law enforcement, and even foreign policy, we're creating a reality where fundamental aspects of our lives are determined by processes that are in principle opaque to us. More importantly, these systems are being developed and controlled by a very small number of organizations and individuals who are not subject to the same accountability and democratic control mechanisms that regulate other forms of social power. The concentration of computational power and data in the hands of a few large technology corporations has created a situation where decisions made by a few dozen people in Silicon Valley offices can have deeper impacts on the daily lives of billions of people than decisions made by democratically elected governments. This concentration of power is not just a matter of economic policy. It's a fundamental restructuring of the architecture of human power that's happening without any significant public debate or adequate oversight and control mechanisms. The year 2026 emerges as a critical inflection point because it's when multiple technological, economic, and social trends will converge in ways that make it impossible to continue ignoring these fundamental contradictions. The AI systems being developed now will reach a level of sophistication where they'll begin to surpass humans in increasingly broad areas of decision-making, creating irresistible pressures to automate increasingly critical aspects of our social infrastructures. Geopolitical tensions resulting from competition for limited resources and technological disruption will reach points where traditional mechanisms of international cooperation may no longer be sufficient to maintain stability. Climate change will produce extreme events with frequency and intensity that exceed the response capacity of institutions designed to deal with much smaller and more predictable variations. More importantly, it's when the generation that grew up completely immersed in digital environments will reach positions of leadership and power, bringing not only familiarity with digital technologies, but also completely different expectations about privacy, autonomy, authority, and the appropriate relationships between individuals and systems. This convergence will create an environment where the contradictions we've managed to ignore or manage through palliative measures will become so evident and disruptive that they'll force a fundamental restructuring of how we organize societies, economies, and our relationship with technology. I need to stop for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this future we're discussing most arouses your fear or apprehension? Do you also lie awake at night thinking about it? I know we often keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps for fear of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My greatest fear about our technological future is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to confront them. The question we must confront is not whether we can avoid this transformation because the forces driving it are already in motion and irreversible, but rather how we can navigate through it in a way that preserves what we most value about the human experience. The illusion of security that's about to be destroyed wasn't entirely negative. It allowed human societies to create art, science, philosophy, and forms of love and cooperation that would be impossible in environments of total uncertainty. The challenge is discovering how we can maintain these essential human capacities in a world where we need to accept fundamentally higher levels of uncertainty and develop new forms of resilience that don't depend on centralized systems of control and protection. This requires a transformation not only in our technologies and institutions, but in our collective psychology, our relationship with risk, our understanding of what it means to be human in a world where humans are no longer the only intelligent agents. We need to learn to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, to use technology without being controlled by it, to cooperate on a global scale without losing our individual autonomy, and to plan for the future without the illusion that we can completely control it. This is not a task that can be accomplished by political leaders, technologists, or specialists alone. It requires a transformation in collective consciousness that can only emerge through honest and deep conversations between ordinary people who are willing to confront uncomfortable realities and imagine possibilities that go beyond the familiar structures of the world we know. The first step in this transformation is recognizing that our current sense of security is to a large extent an illusion, and that accepting this reality is not cause for despair, but an opportunity to discover more authentic and sustainable forms of human well-being. When we stop depending on external systems for our sense of security and begin developing internal resources of resilience, flexibility, and adaptability, we discover that we are much more capable and resourceful than we thought. When we stop delegating responsibility to specialized institutions and begin taking personal responsibility for understanding and influencing the systems of which we are part, we discover that we have much more power and agency than we realized. When we stop trying to control external variables over which we have little influence and begin focusing on developing our capacity to respond creatively to changing circumstances, we discover a freedom and vitality that cannot be threatened by external disruptions. The destruction of the illusion of security in 2026 may represent the end of an era of collective infantilization and the beginning of a new era of human maturity, where our species learns to live consciously in a universe that is fundamentally uncertain, dynamic, and constantly changing. This doesn't mean a return to barbarism or chaos, but an evolution toward forms of social organization that are more flexible, resilient, and aligned with the basic realities of existence. Instead of trying to eliminate all uncertainty and risk through control and predictability, we can learn to dance with uncertainty in ways that reveal creative possibilities we couldn't have imagined when we were trapped in rigid security structures, instead of depending on external authorities to tell us what is safe and what is dangerous. We can develop our own capacity for discernment and navigation in complex environments. Instead of trying to build increasingly higher walls to protect us from unwanted changes, we can learn to surf the waves of transformation in ways that take us to places more interesting and fulfilling than those we could have reached through control. This transformation has already begun at the margins of our society, where individuals and communities are experimenting with alternative forms of organization that privilege adaptability over stability, diversity over uniformity, and personal responsibility over institutional dependence. People are learning to cultivate food, generate energy, educate children, care for health, and resolve conflicts through methods that are more local, participatory, and resilient than the centralized systems most of us still depend on. Artists, philosophers, scientists, and technologists are exploring creative possibilities that emerge when we stop trying to replicate the past and begin imagining genuinely new futures. Organizations are experimenting with decentralized structures that distribute power and responsibility in ways that make systems more robust and less vulnerable to catastrophic failures. These experiments are still minority and marginal, but represent seeds of possibilities that can become dominant when centralized systems can no longer maintain the illusion of security that justified their hegemony. What's at stake is not just our physical survival, but our evolution as a conscious species that can learn to live in harmony with forces greater than ourselves without losing our dignity, creativity, and capacity for love. The approaching crisis is also an opportunity to discover resources and capacities we didn't know we possessed, to develop forms of cooperation that transcend the limitations of hierarchical structures, and to create culture that celebrates uncertainty as a source of possibility instead of fearing it as a source of threat. When we stop spending...
I would assume that us having more information and more access to information would lead to more truth, less conspiracy, more agreement, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, not at all. Most information in the world is junk. It's like with food. There was a time, like a century ago in many countries, where food was scarce. So people ate whatever they could get, especially it was full of fat and sugar. And they thought that more food is always good. Like if you ask your great-grandmother, she would tell, yes, more food is always good. And then we reach a time of abundance, and we have all this industrialized processed food, which is artificially full of fat and sugar and salt and whatever. And it's obviously bad for us. The idea that more food is always good, no. And definitely not all this junk food. And the same thing has happened with information. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, they had the hijab laws, which says that every woman, when she goes out, walking or even driving in her private car, she must wear the hijab. And until today, the regime had difficulty enforcing the hijab laws because they didn't have, millions of police officers that you can place on every street. A police officer, if a woman drives without a headscarf, immediately she's arrested and fined or whatever. In the last few years, they switched to relying on an AI system. Iran is now crisscrossed by surveillance cameras with facial recognition software, which recognizes automatically if in the car that just passed by the camera, the facial recognition software can identify that this is a woman, not a man, and she's not wearing the hijab, and identify her identity, find her phone number, and within half a second, they send her an SMS message saying, you broke the hijab law, your car is impounded. And it's not like there is a report that goes to the court and some human judge goes over the data and decides what to do. The AI immediately decides, okay, the car is confiscated.
What do you have to say to democratic countries where we also see a bombarding of information like this impacting the democracy?
Democracy, in essence, is a conversation between a large number of people, which has strong self-correcting mechanisms. You need to keep the conversation, and to have a conversation, you must have many voices. If there is only one voice which is allowed to be heard, this is not a conversation. This is dictatorship. This is a monologue, a dictate. The other thing is, a country must have a self-correcting mechanism, especially for the government, that if the government make a mistake, there is an independent media, there are independent courts that can expose and correct the mistake of the government, and ultimately, there are free and fair elections in which the people can replace the government. As long as you have these mechanisms, democracies are safe. You can have different governments with this policy or that policy and experiment. As long as there are these checks and balances and the ultimate ability to replace the government, then the democracy is safe. The danger in every democracy, and this goes back thousands of years, in a democracy you give one person or one party the power for a limited duration on condition they afterwards give it back to the people and the people can make a different choice next time. The danger is, what if you give power to someone who then doesn't give it back? They use the power they have to take over the institutions, to rig the elections, to control the media, and then you can never replace them. That was always the big dangers in democracy. You can have strong institutions, but government ultimately is able to corrupt all these institutions. So people should make wise choices and be very careful not to give power to people who might not want to give it back.